I will be chairing today's session. So for a bit of an introduction, I will introduce our speakers today, um, Dr. Zachary Levenson and Dr. Marcel Paret, who will be speaking on the South African tradition of racial capitalism from margin to center. Their bios read as Dr. Zachary is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and senior research associate in sociology at the University of Johannesburg. For the current academic year, he is a Donald D. Harrington Faculty Fellow in Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the author of Delivery of Dispossession, Land Occupation, and Eviction in the Post-Apartheid City, and the founding editor of the Radical Journal's background. Dr. Marcel Paret is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Utah and senior research associate in the Center of Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. Is author of Fractured Militants, Victorious Resistance in South Africa After Racial Inclusion, and co-editor of Southern Resistance and Critical Perspective, the Politics of Protest in South Africa, South Africa's Contentious Democracy. You have about 20 to 25 minutes, and over to you.
Okay, hello everybody. Thanks so much to all of you for coming out to this talk, and thanks so much to the folks at the History Workshop. It's an honor to be here with this sort of storied institution. So we're going to talk today about what we're calling the South African tradition of racial capitalism, and this project comes out of, well, a bunch of different places. I'm going to give a little bit of a background, but it comes out of this growing popularity of the term racial capitalism, particularly in the United States. Slide. So if you look at this graph, it shows mentions of the term racial capitalism in books, and you can see that it's grown dramatically over the last decade or so. But what you also see from this graph is that there was an earlier heyday of racial capitalism, peaking in the 1980s, which of course was also the peak of the anti-apartheid movement. And it's become a bit of an obligation, particularly in the United States, for people writing about racial capitalism to say, hey, you know, there was this earlier history where racial capitalism was born, the idea was born in South Africa, and then they just move on. And so this project comes out of Zach and I talking to each other about how this rich literature coming out of the anti-apartheid movement on racial capitalism has been largely neglected. So this project is about bringing that, doing a deeper dive into that history and into the debates that were going on in the 70s and 80s around race and class and the relationship between racism and capitalism. Slide. So this project and these discussions come out of our earlier work. So both Zach and I have been doing research on South Africa for quite a long time. We both just put out books in the last year based largely on ethnographic and interview methods. So Zach has been studying land occupations in Cape Town, and I've been studying community struggles around Johannesburg. And these projects are both also tracing the historical trajectory, and they're both very much engaged in left movements. So these are things that we've been thinking about and writing about for quite a long time, although not necessarily with the frame of the idea of racial capitalism. So one of the things that we're doing now is building on our earlier research and kind of digging deeper into the history to unpack some of these things that we've been thinking about and reading about, but spending a little bit more time focusing on them. Slide. So just to give you a little bit about the project as it's been unfolding so far. So if you look at the right side of this slide, we've been collecting oral histories with anti-apartheid activists, folks, particularly those who are to the left of the Congress tradition, the ANC and the SACP. So for me, this is the most exciting part of the project. We've done a bunch of interviews so far with people who were active in the 70s and 80s. Unfortunately, we're not able to dig into that today. That's not, we don't have the space or the time to do that, and we're still sort of working through that. But that's where this project is headed, is through these interviews. And really, our goal is to understand how were people thinking about the relationship between race and class, racism and capitalism during the 70s and 80s in the heat of these struggles, as a way of building this theory of racial capitalism and thinking about what its relevance might be for today. So in addition to these interviews, we've also been doing archival work, as well as lots and lots of reading of secondary literature. So if you look at the other side of this slide, you can see some of the things that we started to produce already. In some ways, as I said, these are a little bit preliminary because we haven't really gotten to start writing about the interviews yet. But we have a paper in Du Bois Review about how racial capitalism moved back and forth between South Africa and the United States, as well as in and out of the academy. We are also putting out this year a special issue of the journal Ethnic and Racial Studies on this idea of a South African tradition of racial capitalism. And you can see we've listed here the contributors to that issue, probably many of whom are folks who you will know. It's a mix of people from South Africa and the United States, mostly on the South Africa side. So that should be coming out later this year. Keep an eye out for that. We've also got two other papers, which I'm only going to very briefly mention. One is a paper comparing the theories of racial capitalism developed by Cedric Robinson, who's very much celebrated, especially in the United States, but to some extent in South Africa as well, comparing his ideas about racial capitalism to those of Stuart Hall, who of course was also very much engaged in the debates in South Africa in the 80s. And then we're also currently right now working on a paper about the communist parties in the United States and South Africa, comparing them and their engagements in Black struggle and anti-racist resistance and attempts to link it to a communist movement. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I could talk for ages about that paper, but for lack of time, let's before we move on. So what we're doing today is talking about our introduction to the special issue of that special issue that's coming out later this year. And Zach and I will have an essay that launches that, sort of introduces that issue and launches it. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, slide. So we open our introduction by pointing to this pamphlet, which we found in the archive at Wits. And what's so amazing about this pamphlet, it's a pamphlet put out by the Cape Youth Congress, which was an affiliate of the UDF. And they put out this pamphlet in 1987, which refers to a group called RC or RC theorists, okay? And in this group, they lumped together left groupings such as the Cape Action League, the Black Consciousness Movement, the Marxist Workers Tendency, and it suggests that they're all part of this same group. Now, what distinguishes this group is that they're all opposed to the two-stage theory of transition that was being promoted by the ANC and the SACP. So, of course, the idea of two-stage transition was that first, there had to be a national democratic revolution to democracy. And then after that, and only after that, could there be a socialist revolution. So let me just read you a brief thing from this pamphlet. They say, the central argument of RC is that the class and national aspects cannot be separated. The historical emergence of capitalism in SA has taken on a racial form. Here, interesting is the contention by RC that race and class are intertwined, and that they constitute one problem or contradiction. In other words, apartheid and capitalism do not represent two contradictions, but a single one, i.e. racial capitalism. Okay, now what's interesting is that this document is a polemic against these groups that they're identifying as racial capitalism. Okay, there's, they are affiliated with the UDF, they're in favor of the two-stage approach, so they're rejecting the RC theorists. But what we're doing in this paper and in the larger project is taking this same idea and taking it more seriously. and saying, okay, what were all these folks who were to the left of the Congress, to the left of the UDF, what were they thinking about? How were they understanding this relationship between racism and capitalism? Okay, slide. So what we're going to do in the rest of this talk is basically outline what we do in this introductory essay. And there are really two key tasks that we tackle. One is an organizational mapping of the anti-apartheid movement to the left of the Congress. Okay, so basically unpacking what that pamphlet called the RC theorists of the RC tradition. And then what we do in the paper is we develop 4 theses that come out of this sort of ecosystem of movements. And so what we'll do in the rest of this talk is briefly map out the sort of organizational landscape, and then we'll talk about these 4 key theses that kind of hold together what we're calling the South African tradition of racial capitalism. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zach, who's going to take it the rest of the way.
Thanks, Marcel, and thanks again for having us. So I wanted to move pretty quickly through this clearly overwhelming chart, but I want to begin by emphasizing a point from one of the pieces that's in the special issue by Andy Clarno, and many of you might know Salim Valley. And so they have this contribution to the special issue where they argue that the SAT, the South African tradition of racial capitalism, was forged in the context of struggle, as they put it. And so it's essential, we think, to situate the theoretical points that we're calling the SAT in relation to the various political tendencies and organizations that produce that politics. And so I want to emphasize here that race-class debates in the period were not merely analytic, but were strategic, linked as they were to the ongoing anti-apartheid movement. So I don't have time for a full overview and working through every single entry in this again, kind of overwhelming map, but I wanted to point out a couple of things. So it's an incredibly diverse group of organizations. What all these groups have in common? Well, one, if they viewed the fundamental reformism of the Freedom Charter. They view the Freedom Charter as fundamentally reformist. That document never called for severing links with imperialist powers, never for abolishing capitalism. And so there's this reformist charge against the Freedom Charter. And then second, a critique of, as Marcel talked about, the stagism of the Congress tradition, this 2-stage theory, this idea that first we fight racism and then we fight capitalism. Well, members of the SAT, we want to argue, insisted that they both had to be confronted simultaneously, 1 stage instead of 2, as the Keiko pamphlet that Marcel cited put it. So let me say a few things quickly about this mapping. So first, along this, this top axis, we can see various post-unity movement formations. For those who know the non-European unity movement, Abdusa, which splits from the unity movement in, I think, 57, winds up playing a role in our project. The various Neville Alexander groups that come out of the unity movement through Yu Chi Chan and ultimately Cape Action League enter into the National Forum in 1983 and 84, play a key role. In a second row, we see various BC linked, Black consciousness linked trajectories here. Still very diverse politics within this singular trajectory, but we want to point out this BC trajectory. That after Soweto, when a number of BPC activists are driven into exile, we often hear the story about how while in exile in Botswana, they're absorbed into ANC. But we also are uncovering those who refuse to join the ANC and form the Black consciousness movement of Azania, who then, upon returning to South Africa in the 90s, wind up joining up with Azapo. Azapo plays this key role in catalyzing the National Forum, organizing it with the Cape Action League, and then all these other groups go in. So we have BC-linked unions like BAMKU, like KUSA, which, to emphasize, they're both independent, but BC-linked. Now, in a third row here, we can see a couple of Trotskyist organizations that were quite different in orientation from the others. They don't go into the National Forum, though a couple of their members attended. So we have the Marxist workers' tendency, which linked to the British militant tendency, largely comes out of the Durban strikes in '73. And then we have the Workers' International League of South Africa, much lesser known. Eventually, they find links to a group in Britain, but are largely autonomous during this period. And they're coming out of community struggles on the Cape Flats. And what's interesting about both of these groups is they tried to do entryist work. So the Marxist workers' tendency famously was the Marxist workers' tendency of the ANC. They're trying to do entryist work in the ANC before they ultimately get expelled. And then in the case of WILSA, they were trying to do entryist work in the UDF in the 80s. Again, a quite distinct politics from the National Forum, which sought complete independence from the UDF. WILSA was trying to do entryist work in the UDF. And then finally, in the paper, we talk more about all of these tendencies. We have a couple of unions of interest here. So I mentioned the BC-linked unions like BAMKU and KUSA, who go into the National Forum. You have, of course, FOSATU, which once pushed for working class independence from the multi-class Congress Alliance, most famously in Joe Foster's speech, though ultimately, of course, FOSATU winds up going into COSATU. And then with COWUSA, even though it winds up going into COSATU, there's also work being done, some great work now being done by Kaiser Tebedi on the rise of a group called the Independent Socialists who come out of COWUSA. So, overwhelming map. So what in the world did all these groups have in common, despite the obvious and really overwhelming diversity? Well, we want to suggest that all maintained a critique of the SACP and the ANC, or the Congress traditions, two-stage theory of revolution. And instead, all of these groups in various ways insisted upon a single stage. In other words, fighting racism and capitalism simultaneously instead of in sequence. But we want to get a bit more specific than that. And so what we've done here is to develop at length in the paper 4 central theses that we suggest captures the politics of the SAT. So first, class struggle from above, or the pursuit of profit, is what generates racism. Clearly, this is a formulation, for those of you who have read Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, this is quite distinct from Robinson's position, right? Robinson insists that racism has origins independent of capitalist development, but we're suggesting that all of the SAT theorists considered here root the development of racism in capitalist development. So, as Biko puts the point in I Write What I Like, he writes, there's no doubt that the color question in South African politics was originally introduced for economic reasons. Or coming from Abdusa, IB Tabata argues, well, at first this racialism was fostered in the economic interests of the white employers, what was intended to facilitate the keeping of the blacks in a subordinate position, so that they would be an ever-ready source of cheap labor, feeding the triple demands of the industrial machine, the gold mines, and the white farms. It gained so much momentum in the course of time that now it exists on its own, right? So Tabata is saying that racism emerges from capitalist development, but then gains a certain relative autonomy and becomes, as he says, well, it exists on its own. And in the full paper, we worked through additional formulations coming from the Marxist workers' tendency, Neville Alexander, and many others. Second, the capitalist state is the primary agent of racialization. So proponents of SAT argued that the colonial or apartheid state developed and implemented racist policies, including segregation, influx control, political repression, other forms of racial exclusion here, for the benefit of capitalists. So this key role of the state underscores the historical specificity of racial capitalism. South African capitalism rested upon racism and racial division in the 19th and 20th centuries. The precise character of this racism, again, as implemented and secured by the state, shifts over time, typically in response to the contours of class struggle from above and below. So this was not a generalized and transhistorical racism, but rather what Stuart Hall would call a conjunctural racism in its historical specific context. So one interesting thing to note here is that many activists outside the SAT, those subscribing, say, to the SACP's colonialism of a special type thesis also made this argument about the state, that the capitalist state is a primary agent of racialization. But what we want to emphasize here, what's really crucial, is that the Congress tradition, on the one hand, the SAT, on the other hand, came to really different political conclusions based on this thesis. So if the SAT and CST both recognize that capitalists and the capitalist state underpin racism and apartheid, they disagreed about how to respond to this. So in contrast to the two-stage transition implied in the analysis of the CST, proponents of the SAT sought to link struggles against racism and capitalism. They viewed the two, in other words, as inseparable, right? And this brings us to our most important theses, 3 and 4. So third, racial ideology can divide, enabling capitalism, but can also unify, facilitating resistance. Now, if this seems obvious, let me just point out that often we get this story that class unifies, but race divides. And what we want to suggest is that the SAT had a far more nuanced view of race, in which race too can be a unifying device. So a distinctive aspect of the SAT approach was a pairing of a healthy skepticism of the divisive potential of certain racial categories with the recognition that these same categories can be rearticulated as a unifying force. Skeptical impulse identified a certain commonality between the thinking of the apartheid state on the one hand, and then the multiracialism of the Congress tradition on the other. So if the former, the apartheid state, insisted upon a hierarchy of essential differences, rooted, of course, in biology and culture, the ANC's Four Nations thesis was similarly based in a sort of primordialism. And Neville Alexander's a really forceful critique of this in his book, One Azania, One Nation. So this tendency is even evident in the SACP's theorizing, which drew heavily on Stalin's definition of the nation. And for proponents of the SAT, apartheid formulations and the multiracialism of the ANC and the SACP were two sides of the same coin. They both took racial categories as relatively immutable. And so in response, SAT strategists sought to redefine race as fundamentally political and thus malleable, a category that could either divide or unite. And so in the paper, we discuss all sorts of examples of race as unifying, from, I think, most famously, Biko's conception of Blackness, Neville Alexander's hostility to multiracialism, the role of the unity movement, and so forth. And then fourth and finally, racial capitalism is a strategic concept that emphasizes the inseparability of anti-capitalist and anti-racist struggle. So if the various groups discussed today under the banner of the SAT all appear to converge on the Black working class by the early 80s, this wasn't incidental. So this figure of the Black working class becomes really central to the SAT. And as a singular figure, the class faction represents the strategic refusal to separate the national and social struggles into distinct stages, right? First against racism, then against capitalism. Proponents of the colonialism of a special type thesis coming out of the Congress tradition aligned themselves with the ANC and argued that the working class was gaining influence in that organization. Supporters of the SAT, meanwhile, saw this as a dangerous mistake. They would focus on the fight for legal equality at the expense of anti-capitalist struggle. So just as race alone was insufficient as the basis for revolutionary activity, so too was class alone, according to the SAT. It was the Black working class that had to play this role. And so in this view, the white working class had become what Neville Alexander calls a junior partner in the class alliance that governed South Africa. Or as Tabata put the point, and I think this really echoes Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, the white worker's bill of wages is subsidized from that of the Black worker. So because racism and capitalism are so intimately interlinked, it was the SAT's key intervention to redirect strategic forces to the point of connection, of articulation. So when racism and capitalism are disarticulated, when they're separated, as in, say, Congress materials or in liberal formulations, they're inevitably reduced to stages, right? First racism, then capitalism. The problem is that racism in the ANC and SICP formulation, defined as a force to be overthrown through national democratic revolution, remains a moving target. Formal legal equality has done little today to equalize South Africa. Even as the Black middle class swells, the poorest and most exploited sectors of the working class remain nearly exclusively Black. And so a key insight of SAT continues to ring true, that the South African model of capitalism relies upon racist forms of exclusion, even today. And this implies that a successful challenge to either racism or capitalism requires a unified and protracted struggle to challenge them both simultaneously and together. So to wrap up here, I just want to really reiterate here that while we've emphasized the unity of the South African tradition, the SAT, it's an incredibly diverse tradition. So this is only a point of departure. Much more work remains to be done. Marcel talked about these oral histories we're collecting and some of the archival work we're doing. So this is only a kind of preliminary attempt to figure out what do all these diverse groups to the left of the Congress tradition have in common. It's a massive project, going to require a lot of collaborative research going forward. And I know there are many other folks, including in the history workshop, working on this stuff. And their work has been really, really important for us. So I think I mentioned before Kaiser Tibedi, also the work of Asher Gemedze, Alison Drew is doing some important work on this right now, Salim Valley and Motala, many, many others. But our crucial takeaway, if I were to limit it to a sentence, would be to say that racial capitalism is a concept forged in struggle, and that to understand the true meaning of racial capitalism in a South African context, which only subsequently enters the academy, it's fundamental to examine it in its struggle context. To understand the context of struggle, again, as Clarno and Valley put it, to understand how racial capitalism serves a strategic function. So I will leave it at that and looking forward to questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Levenson. Now I'm just going to open the floor for discussion. 3 questions at a time, and then you have to take those questions. Could people please just put their hands up on the thing, and then or the questions on the chats, if you have any question or comments.
I see we schedule a lot of questions.
I'm trying to ask a question, but I think my screen is messing up with me in terms of raising a hand.
Okay, no, you can go ahead. You can go ahead, Chris. No, you can go ahead, because are you still with us?
Oh, HITF. No, sorry, I thought you were speaking to someone else. Okay. No, thanks for the presentation. Yeah, Kwesi here. Just 2 questions from my side. The one is whether you guys have engaged with the work of Bernard Magubane, particularly his work on the political economy of race and class, and the making of a racist state, and how he historicizes racism in relation to capitalism, and even draw some comparative sort of analysis with the Irish question. So I wanted to check whether you guys have engaged with that literature from Makubane in those two texts. The second question has to do with the relationship between racial capitalism and questions around gender and the position of Black African women. In the South African context. And are you guys also thinking through that? I just wanted to raise those two issues.
Sihle, can I go ahead?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Okay. I'll just ask the first two initial questions. I have some more, but maybe we'll start with this one, where Levenson says, okay, there's the first point I think that he made, that class struggle from above, the pursuit of profit. If I remember correctly, I was saying it generates racism. I think perhaps I didn't understand him. And then he also, I think in the second point said, the capitalist state is the primary agent of racialization. Perhaps you can correct me if I misunderstood him or did not hear him correctly. But I want to find out from him whether is racism generated from capitalism, or is racism just racism without capitalism, just based on how one's phenotype appears. So I think that is my first question. It's based on his intimation that it may not have been generalized or transnational, but it was conjunctural. So I hope I'm clear in my question.
Yes. No, good question.
All right. Then I'll ask the second question maybe later.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ngos. I think you can go ahead because I don't see any hand up, so we can have at least 3 questions for this part of the first session of the questions.
All right. Zach, you want me to go?
Either way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll talk for a couple of minutes, and you can jump in. I mean, I think the Magubane question is really fascinating, and we spent a bunch of time reading Magubane, and we have written a bit about him in the paper as well. The first thing that I should say though is that we have a piece in the special issue by Bongani Nayoka, which is specifically on Magubane and connecting him to this tradition. Now, I think Magubane is a really interesting question because of his political affiliations, and that's where I think this project and specifically this paper is a little bit tricky. Is that you have folks who certainly were interested in these processes of racial capitalism, who don't necessarily fit into the ecosystem that Zach was mapping out, right? So take somebody like Magubane, who was linked to the ANC. And of course, the ANC was in favor of the two-stage theory, which is sort of the opposite of what we're talking about in this sort of South African tradition. So one of the tricky things is that, and in particular, if you think about these 4 theses that we've developed, the first 2 are not necessarily unique to the South African tradition of racial capitalism. In fact, many proponents of the CST NDR thesis would agree with these ideas. It's when you get into the later theses, and in particular the last one about the inseparability of sort of anti-racist and anti-capitalist struggle, that the SAT really starts to distinguish itself. But you have folks like Magubane, you have folks like Wolpe, who certainly in their scholarship were very much in line with the kinds of thinking that we're talking about in this project, but politically align themselves with either the ANC or the SACP or both. So it's a bit of a tricky area, but yeah. But I think I can speak for Zach that we're both big fans of Magubane, and certainly we'll be considering him and including him in this project. Let me just say one other thing about this idea of racism as being general or coming out of capitalism. I mean, I think there are different views out there, and one of the things that we're up to in this project is to highlight these different approaches. So, in my reading, and Zach, you should say whether you think this is true, whether you feel this way too, but this tradition that we're trying to establish, this sort of ecosystem of movements, was very much suggesting that racism comes out of capitalism, right? That's not to say that they are necessarily right or the only view, right? And I mentioned this other paper that we've written. It's currently under review at the moment, contrasting Stuart Hall and Cedric Robinson. And one of the things that we do in that paper is to use those two theorists to sort of suggest, look, there are two different ways of thinking about racial capitalism, right? And certainly the idea that racism is more general and not directly linked to capitalism. In fact, Robinson suggests that racism precedes capitalism. That's one way of approaching it, right? Stuart Hall suggests another way. And I would argue that this South African tradition, this ecosystem of movements, leans closer to the Stuart Hall side, right? Really very much rooting the emergence of racism within capitalism. But it's a debate. And one of the things that I think we're trying to do in this project, both in this paper, but more generally, is to really open up that debate and to really get people to think critically about these different perspectives rather than assuming one or the other. So Zach, I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, no, I think Marcel made that last point well. I mean, I would agree. I think to be clear, these theses aren't our formulations so much as an attempt to capture what we're calling the politics of SAT. And we're actually quite surprised in reading through this stuff, the extent to which there was a convergence on this position that racism emerges from capitalist development or from the accumulation imperative, which of course is quite different from another prevailing view, as Marcel just pointed to, in the work of say Cedric Robinson, this notion that racialism, as Robinson calls it, pre-exists the emergence of capitalism. But all of the folks that we encounter in the SAT seem to fall on the side of arguing that capitalism generates racism, but that once it generates racism, it becomes relatively autonomous, right? This was Tabata's point. Yes, we can definitely send the paper. It was also, I think, circulated on the history workshop email, but or else just shoot us an email and we can send. We're happy to send it to anyone who wants. On the gender question, which I think is a really crucial one. So part of the problem we're encountering in these oral histories is the extent to which these are overwhelmingly male-dominated organizations. And so what we've begun to do is seek out women activists who are largely marginalized in these organizations and collecting these oral histories as well. But let me say something more broadly about understanding racial capitalism in relation to gender. So I think there's a tendency to understand this concept of reproduction, so common in say, Marxist theory circles, in a South African context, through the lens of, say, Wolpe, right? That the reproduction of the wage laborer or the miner is subsidized by work coming from semi-proletarianized household production in the reserves. And it's that connection, right? What he calls the articulation of modes of production. So reproduction for Wolpe is kind of about the rural and then the site of employment. And rural reproduces the worker at the site of employment. Gender is not even mentioned, but of course, women are largely doing this work in the reserves. And so I think it's crucial to understand, say, the reproduction in Wolpe's formulation in conjunction with, say, current writings on social reproduction theory and the gendered nature of household reproduction. So this is another way that it figures into the project. And then just a quick note on, so in, and I should mention in the special issue, there's actually a great paper from Bridget Kenny on just this question. I mean, the role of gender figuring into these analyses of racial capitalism. That one is actually, if you go to the Ethnic and Racial Studies website, that one is available in preprint version. And so you can access it, or I saw Bridget on here before. I don't know if she's still here, but, or you can email her if you know her and ask for the paper. Also, just wanted to respond quickly to this question in the chat from Liz Carmichael about the National Forum. So she says that the PAC and AZAPO in '91 refused to co-sign any document with the government, but then there's this organization, the National Forum, that did. But that National Forum was a grouping of Black governmental organizations friendly to the government, completely distinct from what we're calling the National Forum. So she says, was there really an organization on the left called the National Forum? So yes, and we discussed this a bit in the paper, but going back to that map, it's essentially an attempt initiated by AZAPO, but then in conjunction with Neville Alexander and the Cape Action League and a bunch of other groups. So in Johannesburg, Action Youth, for those of you who know Salim Bali, he comes out of Action Youth, another group that goes into it, some of the BC linked unions like Bamku and Kusa go into it, and they all come together in 1983. It's kind of prepped at a AZAPO meeting in late 82, come together in Hammanskraal in 83. There's a second National Forum meeting in 84. And interestingly enough, the UDF launches just a few months after the launch of the National Forum. And so there's a way to read the UDF and the National Forum as in contention, almost as an opposition, where the National Forum represents what we're calling the SAT, and the UDF represents the Congress tradition, the two-stage position. So there are some scattered references to the National Forum. There is stuff written. If you send me an email, I can send the paper, and there's some references in there to some key pieces, including some written at the time. In I think volumes 2 and 3 of the South African Review, so there's some great pieces on the National Forum.
Can I just ask a little bit further?
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Good, yes. Did that National Forum have any organizational being, and did it continue? Because in the period that I was working on towards the National Peace Accord, it didn't feature at all. I never came across it. Late 80s, early 90s.
Yes, so they have these two major meetings in 83 and 84, start to organize on the basis. Some affiliated with the National Forum will argue that it continued for a few more years, but largely it fragmented into its component groups. And so what winds up happening is, in the map, we have a kind of trajectory coming out of the National Forum that forms a group called WOZA. And WOZA so has this legacy tied to they're largely involved in the National Forum, but refuses collaboration at the moment, much like the PAC and AZAPO. And then out of WOZA comes the Workers' List Party, which then also refuses to participate in the negotiations. So the story isn't, this is actually something we're working on right now through these oral histories, is trying to figure out what in the world happened to the National Forum after the second meeting in 84. And this period between the launching of WOZA and the second National Forum meeting in 84.
Right, WOZA certainly did continue.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, I'm still struggling with the screen, but
All right,
can I
now you
ask
can
a
go ahead,
question?
Dr. Ngozi.
Okay. Well, two things really, if not three, but I'm battling with a few things. I think that Zach, can I call you Zach? Is that
Yes,
okay?
of course, of course.
All right. I don't know, you can correct me, but I think that you had said earlier that the problem was that racism in the ANC, or racism as defined in the ANC, to fight through the NDR remains a moving target. I remember you saying that, and that the most exploited classes in South Africa remain exclusively Black. Okay. Now to build on that, I think that it was Marcel. Is it Marcel? That was saying that
Yes.
we're now trying to establish this tradition. We're referring to it as SAT, right? And within the context of this ecosystem, right? So hence we're now looking at the National Forum. So my questions lie at, are you at any point looking at organizations that are not Black? Because if you're going to discuss capitalism, or what you say is racial capitalism as a strategic concept that you argue is inseparable with the liberation movement in South Africa, do you, in your paper or in your work, look at the organizations that the liberation movement was fighting against in your attempt to develop a South African tradition? Let me qualify my question, because when Zach says he doesn't know what happened to the National Forum after 1984, or there was an 83 or 84 meeting, I mean, a lot happened that influenced the direction of the fragmentation and the disappearance of the National Forum, simply because after the intensification of MK operations in the 80s, and I think it was after the death of, or the assassination of Dr. David Webster at the time, there was secret meetings between the ANC leadership, primarily led by Thabo Mbeki, and Neil Barnard and the NIS at the time. So, but largely the discussion was being led by the argument that South Africa can develop a non-racial society. So these are my thoughts, but of course I've embedded my question in my thoughts. And so when people began to see the possibility that we could try and transform the country without revolutionary violence, then they began to test the theory whether different race groups, as it were, can coexist peacefully. And I think that's where we are. And that's the difference between what happened in Angola, the civil war in Angola, and in Mozambique that Frelimo was waging, and also the challenges that SWAPO was having, led by Sam Nujoma in Namibia. So the question was really, can South Africa transform without a racialized civil war? So those are my thoughts. I hope you've picked up my question, Zach, and maybe you could share your ideas. Let me hear what you think.
Yeah, that's a great question. Sorry, organizers, do you want to take multiple, or should we answer now?
Yes, Karen has a question, so I think let's take the question. And you, Ariana, do you have a question? I see your hand up on the chat.
Yeah, sorry, it's Tavi, so I'm standing in for Ariana. But yeah, I have a brief question.
All right. So we'll take Karen's question, and then your question, Taviso, and then Dr. Zachary and Marcel will take the three questions for this session, and then we might come to a close since we have about 10 minutes.
Hi, Marcel. Hi, Zach. So good to hear about what you've been working on. It's yeah, really fascinating stuff. But what I was wondering is whether you could just give like and this is a really hard question to answer, but just some brief indication around how you feel that this political tradition translated into post-apartheid politics, given what both of you have extensively engaged in and written in. Just, yeah, where do you see that the roots or the, I don't want to say leftovers because that sounds very disparaging, but where does this in a sense still live in the here and now, I guess, is the question, if at all.
Great.
Okay, so again, this is Tabi, so it's not Ariana, everyone who might think otherwise. My question is a brief one, really. You mentioned that all these groups, the SAT, that they critique the two-stage of the ANC, I think it's the SACP that you also mentioned, that separate the two, or that wanted to attack the two separately, racism and capitalism. I mean, but I just want to rewind a bit and ask, since racism and capitalism, racial capitalism, it's a sort of intertwined into one, how did the ANC or even the SACP envision this strategy of attacking these issues separately? And did they just merely wait for the other one to fall, capitalism, then they'll pick up the pieces of the racism? Or what was their strategy like? Well, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, wow, those are great questions. And actually, there's a real, I think, link between the first two questions. Man, the last one, you know, what was the two-stage strategy actually? That's a really good question. And actually, it's one of the things I mentioned this paper that we're working on right now about communist parties. And part of that project is about trying to understand sort of the other side, right? So if what we're calling the SAT is sort of opposed to the two-stage theory, we're trying to better understand what that two-stage theory was and how that was developing. My quick hunch reaction to that question, though, is that it was not well thought out. That the thinking within those circles was more about immediate strategy and thinking about what kinds of movement and what kind of coalitions do we need to build right now. And the question is, do we build a movement around a multi-class alliance, or do we build a sort of more movement focused on the working class, right? And I think, you know, I think what we're seeing now is the sort of the lack of sort of development of what happens to that movement when sort of the socialist, the second stage gets sort of neglected, right? But to come back to the first question, this was not a sort of like a natural evolution, right? There were active forces involved, and there was a struggle going on, right? And I think you're absolutely right to point to you know, forces from above, from within the apartheid state, and probably also from within the liberation movement that were really pushing against what we're calling the SAT, right? And at the same time, propping up the UDF. So, you know, one of the amazing things that's coming out of these interviews are the ways in which the National Forum was sort of suppressed, and in contrast to the way in which, you know, tons of resources and funds were flowing into the UDF, both from within the country and from abroad, right? And so you could see that, you know, the way in which that sort of unfolds. And then just to link it to Karen's question, you know, where does the SAT live today? You know, largely it's been suppressed and fragmented. But I think, you know, for me personally, what's been so interesting is that, you know, my work studying sort of community struggles and social movements, primarily in Gauteng, in the 2010s, you know, a lot of the people who were active in these movements, and people who were active in the APF and in the DLF and in other, in Germiston Workers' Advice Office, all these groups that Karen, very well, come out of some of these, come out of this ecosystem that we were talking about, right? So for instance, this group of activists involved in WILSA have been a major presence in post-apartheid social movements in Gauteng and around the country. Yeah, so that was my attempt to address all those things in very short period. Zach, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, turning to Dr. Nkosi's question, which I think is a really good one. I mean, we're not willfully excluding white organizations from the SAT, and I should say that some of them do have prominent white members. I mean, for example, the Marxist Workers' Tendency was, of course, for white members of the MWT who were expelled from the ANC in the late 70s. And so we talked quite a bit about Martin Legassic's work in the paper, and but we haven't at this point worked through the framework that you're suggesting, and really talking about the role of negotiations and all of this. And one thing on the horizon for us is thinking about, Marcel just hinted at it, but the relationship between the UDF and the National Forum, and the extent to which all of these groups to the left of the Congress tradition subsequently get written out of the history, right? It's only now that people are starting, other than in some pretty obscure publications in the 80s and 90s, it's only now that historians and other social scientists are trying to really recover this history. And so part of the story we want to tell is about a kind of passive revolution, or the extent to which the National Forum and other tendencies in the SAT were really absorbed into the project of the UDF. So this is one key point. I mean, actually, the question of revolutionary violence is an interesting one because it doesn't figure so frontally in these debates. In fact, very little of what we encountered in both interviews and in writings are about patterning, say, a kind of Fanonian revolutionary violence on the model of SWAPO or something. Hasn't come up. There's certainly attempts to envision the SAT as an anti-colonial movement, explicit reference to SWAPO for Limo, etc. But the question of revolutionary violence, or something like, civil war, has rarely been on the agenda in these interviews so far. And just to echo Marcel, it's just been really fascinating the extent to which we already knew some of these folks, which we didn't realize when we started this project, right? That the extent to which so many people who were involved in this period feel like the struggle is still going on. Some of them still retain allegiance to groups they were in at the time. This is true with a number of Azapo folks, a number of folks who come out of WILSA, for example. But the extent to which they are still active. And so when we see this wave of social movements, really starting with the APF, and then going forward, it's, I think, no coincidence that so many of the key figures involved come out of an earlier struggle in the 80s. And I think they do see it as a kind of, a stalled transition, or a kind of false transition that makes its way through one stage but not the other. And then, this brings me to the question of stages, sort of what exactly this means in practice. I think Marcel's right. They didn't quite know at first. So this language of stages we're finding really comes from an external source. So in 1928, the Comintern, the Communist International, based in Moscow, introduces this language of stages in a resolution for really fighting for Black liberation, but that there's first the stage in the struggle against racism, and then a struggle against capitalism subsequently. But this word stage appears there in the 20s, really makes the comeback when Michael Harmel drafts The Road to South African Freedom, and we get the colonialism of a special type thesis. Again, an emphasis on stages. And some of this has to do with kind of following, I think, Communist Party directives from abroad, and some of it has to do with strategizing at home. I mean, we have to think about the combination of the two and how they interact. We're finding something very similar in our work on the role of the Communist Party in the US, that in the same period, say, where the SACP begins to seek out the ANC, the Communist Party in the US begins to seek out the NAACP of all organizations. And a lot of people ask, why in the world did the Communist Party in the US not begin to work with some of the key groups like, say, CORE or SNCC leading the civil rights movement? And it's because it focused on a kind of two-stage program on linking up with NAACP. But all of this stuff is to say that it's relatively haphazard. I mean, these policy shifts, we don't want to suggest that there's a monolithic two-stage theory that began in 1928 and continues to the present. It's shifted over time. And the precise meaning of these stages has shifted over time. But what we're trying to do in this paper is think about the extent to which these stages, two stages, capture this Congress tradition on the one hand, and a kind of one-stage approach or simultaneous approach captures all the groups in this otherwise quite diverse ecosystem we're calling the SAT.
Yeah, let me just, I'm guessing that we're running out of time, but I'm just noting the comments from the comrade in the chat. If we have a minute, I don't know if the organizers are gonna have a minute, they can sort of spell that out, but if not, please send us a message. Let's, share some of these critical comments about the two-stage. Seems like maybe you think maybe we're not characterizing it correctly, so we'd love to hear your views on that.
Yeah, thanks. Because for the large part of the discussion, I've been hearing a characterization of the two-stage theory as one that involves the idea of first fighting racism and then fighting capitalism. But I think that there's a large body of work and also people that understand it differently to how you understand it, particularly in South Africa, that first, the first stage was to fight for national democracy, whereby the majority could vote because they were disenfranchised. And the second stage was then to usher in socialism. Of course, then if democracy is the first stage, then the second stage would be democratic socialism. And so the challenge here is that I think the challenge that what you had referred to earlier as when you were talking about a moving target, that the most exploited classes in South Africa, and you are right, are arguing that then there was an interregnum where the NDR, as you had said, did not proceed to socialism. And so I think that is the nature of my contention around your characterization of that kind of area. But we can talk, we can discuss, perhaps if I can read the paper and then see how you establish your points, I could maybe share some views in conversations with you. The last comment that I would like to make is on the question of revolutionary violence, that most people obfuscate the idea of revolutionary violence, of the nature of what you saw with the MPLA in Angola, especially the battle at Cuito Carnaval, and where the Cubans came in through Fidel Castro support to fight the apartheid regime. And I think I'd like you guys to look at that, because it's really a pretext for why there was an argument that the liberation movement could have taken South Africa through a revolutionary violence. But of course, then there was the question of talking around stopping violence so as to maintain the current exploitative and capitalist economic system in South Africa. So please look at that as well. And then we could talk more about that. And yeah, but otherwise, guys, this is great stuff. I'm really enjoying the conversation. But I'll respond also to your chat. Thanks.
Yeah,
Oh,
no, and
sounds
thank you
great.
very much for those comments. I mean, I think, yes, we'd very much like to retrieve the history of revolutionary violence in this context, and of anti-colonial violence in particular, and think about not just the SAT, but the entire I mean, part of what we're trying to do more broadly is think about the anti-apartheid movement in relation to anti-colonial struggles and how these ideas circulate regionally. So I think this is really, really crucial. We'd be really appreciative if you'd send us some criticism on the paper. So thank you.
Yeah.
I was muted. All right. Thank you. I think we have run out of time. Thank you for this presentation, and thank you for the questions to our listeners. It was quite an interesting discussion that we had there. Until next time. Yes.
Thank you so much for hosting.
Thanks,
this.
everybody.
Thanks for some great questions.
Thank you. Okay, so Dr. Marcel and Dr. Zach, so usually what we do, I was recording this session here, so I'll upload it on we've got a history workshop YouTube page. So we usually upload our videos there so that people can revisit the discussions anytime they want to. So I hope that is okay with you, but yeah.
That's great. That's great. And thanks so much for having us. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think I'll end the session now.
Are you gone, Tavesa?